Hey guys, my name's Kian Hushman and today I'm going to show you how I go about mixing my guitars in my demos. Let's have a look. I get this question all the time on Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that on how I go about mixing my guitars as well as how I go about mixing in general. So I figured that I'd make a video on how I go about mixing my guitars as that's the topic that I'm most comfortable with. Maybe later down the line I'll do some more. Let me know if you want to see that in the comments below. If you guys like this video at any time, please feel free to leave a like and a comment on anything you see or hear, as well as if you want me to do any more mixing stuff like this. If you guys want to see more videos like this, as well as like gear reviews and song covers and little demos and stuff like that, definitely think about subscribing. And if you want to support the channel, definitely check out the Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description. So with all of that out of the way, let's just jump straight to the screen so I can show you guys how I go about mixing my guitars. So before we get started, I'm going to mention that I am by no means a master mix engineer. However, I do get a lot of questions on like Instagram, on the YouTube comments, Facebook, stuff like that about how I actually go about mixing my songs because people seem to like the guitar sound that I get. So what I've done is I've mixed this little track here. It has like a slow build up section of clean guitar and then a kind of like ambient roomy thing to kick it off into a really heavy section that you might hear in most of the stuff that I make, and then it kind of fades out back into that clean guitar, which you hear in a moment. There are certain things you want to take into consideration before you even start mixing the guitar track, with the main one being you can't turn a turd into gold. And what I mean by that is have a good DI, have a good tone to start with, and that will just make the process a lot easier when you're mixing. By having a really clean, well-recorded DI, you don't have to do like little timing changes between each track. As you can see here, there are no cuts in my tracks at all, although it was a very simple rhythm. Maybe here for like the little build-up bit, just to have a little bit of suspense, I've cut it out there. But with that being said, nothing else is cut into times or whatever. And then having a good source tone to start with, and if you don't like it, you always have the DI to reamp it. So to get started, I'm going to play the track so you guys can hear from start to finish and what I was going for. But before that, I'm just going to go through every track in here so you guys get an idea of how this song is going. So the first track that I'm going to show you is this one here. This is like every single track exported with a little bit of high pass and low pass and room reverb. This was heavily inspired by the Coven intro by Thornhill, which I'm wearing their merch right now. So if you haven't listened to Thornhill, definitely check them out. But all the DIs and stuff, they were already pre-exported in this little track here. So that's why you don't see the drum MIDI being expanded and the bass MIDI being expanded. They've all been closed up to where they just kick in, where I want them to just kick in. And then this track is the drum MIDI. This track is the bass MIDI, which has then been exported into a bass track. Ambient guitars with the DI underneath it. The layered guitar on the left with the DI underneath it. The layered guitar on the right with the DI underneath it. The main guitar on the left with the DI underneath it, the main guitar on the right with the DI underneath it, and then we have a piano MIDI, kind of like an ambient piano, which you hear shortly, as well as like a clean guitar with a lot of delay printed, and as I mentioned before, that's like the whole track with a little bit of reverb and stuff like that, as well as some automation. So as you can see here, the song kind of slowly leads into it like a build up, and then it's kind of level, and then it gets really boomy up here where it's like really kicking in with all the high gain guitars and stuff like that. And then once that's over, it kind of dies down a little bit. This bit of automation here is for this like room reverb track. I just wanted to fade in a little bit. It was a little bit abrupt when it came in, so I just had this like little tiny bit of fade in, which to my ears helped a lot. So now let's just go through it start to finish, and then I'll tell you how I mixed it individually. So as you can probably tell, short and sweet, very, very simple, but I really enjoy this one. So now let's dissect that a little bit. So I'm going to start with the layered section. So this is the layered guitar left and right, which is just a split coil playing the root note of whatever I was playing on the main guitars. So it's just like a one string note. It's a little bit noisy because it's on the split coil section, but I felt like it fitted with the vibe of the song anyway, so I didn't take it into account too much. So this is what the layers sound like. By itself, it kind of sounds disgusting, very, very stringy, a lot of low end being taken out. But when you combine that with the main rhythm guitars, it does help in bringing that definition of the actual note that you're playing, because these are very like chuggy chords and you can kind of get lost in the mix. So having that in there really does go a long way. So before we even get into the mixing, I'm going to mention that all these tracks, like the rhythm guitar bus, the layered guitar bus, the lead guitar, clean guitar, that's all being fed into just a general guitar bus. And the reason why I do that is I just like to automate the level of all the guitars at once rather than doing it individually in every fader when I want to adjust one little section. I feel like having it on the one fader is really, really handy. And then that gets pushed to an instrument bus where you have, this is just like a visualization. I wasn't doing anything with this one. That's completely empty. But below that, we have a bit of virtual mix rack with a little bit high end, low end boost, trimming it back a bit and then reviving it up a bit just to make it a little bit more lively. And then we have it feeding into a compressor. So if you're going with this top-down mixing approach, you want to have that engaged all the time, because if you have that not engaged and then you start mixing your guitars, as soon as you turn that on, there'll be way more high-end, way more low-end that you weren't listening to because it was disengaged. So now starting with the rhythm guitar. So the guitar left and the guitar right are feeding into the same mixer bus, which is the rhythm guitar bus. Now the first thing we have is a bit of EQ. So you might see this in the low end and think, what the hell is he doing? And I'll explain. So in a square room like this, in a little bedroom like this, which I'm sure that many of you would be in the same situation as I am, my representation of low end isn't the greatest. And I have tried into putting little bass traps in the corners and stuff like that. But again, unless you have a big enough room, your low end is always going to be a little bit dodgy. So just to get a little bit more definition out of my low end, what I do is I take these two notches out here at 65 and 80. However, these aren't done blindly. I've done these based on the kick drum and the bass drum. So what I've done is I've gotten an EQ on my kick drum and I've kind of swooped around until I feel like, yeah, that's the frequency where the kick drum is most prominent and it sounds the best. And that was at 65 Hertz. And then I did the same thing for the bass guitar where it sounds perfectly in that region where you're like, yeah, that's the bass guitar. And that was around 80. So I've taken out a couple notches at 65 and 80, which to be honest, you're not going to hear anyway in a full mix on rhythm guitars. But I felt like doing it just a little bit goes a long way in terms of getting a little bit more definition in the low end. And then after that, we have a low cut around 97. I say 100. Again, don't copy this setting 100% because it's not going to be the exact same situation as your mix, as the guitar tone that you already have. All these different considerations that I mentioned before, you should be taking into account before you set where you're going to put your low cut. For example, if I was using a really, really boomy guitar sound, really thick, really sludgy, almost like doom metally, I wouldn't put it around 100. I'd probably scoop it up just a little bit more, maybe around 120, 130, just to suck a little bit more low end out. But for this tone, I felt like it was really neutral and I felt like 100 Hertz is a good starting point. From there, I don't do any shaping, not in FabFilter anyway. I do most of that in Virtual Mix Rack, which I'll get to in a second. But I do take out some whistly frequencies up here, as well as a high cut at around 8.8. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pick out these frequencies and turn them off so you guys can hear what I was hearing before I turned them off. Again, like I was mentioning before, context is everything, so don't go copying this exact setting of 8.7K, 8.8K in your own guitar tone. This is a very high gain guitar tone in a very high gain amp that's pretty stringy. It's the Fortin Nameless from Neural DSP, which is notoriously known for having a lot of definition, but that comes at the cost of a little bit of fizziness and a lot of high end. So taking out that high end at around 8.8K and putting a high cut goes a long way. If you have it off, it gets really fizzy and almost scratchy, but as soon as you turn it on, it smooths it out quite considerably, but it's not smoothed out to the point where it sounds like it's in another room. There's still enough high end to be able to be like, yeah, that's a guitar. So straight after that, I have a multi-band compressor just to clamp down on some of those palm mutes, and as you can see, it's around like 160 Hertz-ish. The purpose of having a multi-band compressor is that when you palm mute your guitar, you're letting a lot more low-end information go through into the amp, and it can get very bloomy, very bassy. And in a full mix contest, when you're sending all of that into like a master bus or something, and you're having more low-end information than what is usually getting fed, it can kind of make the mix fart out a little bit. So taking out that low end when you palm mute and getting a little bit more definition out of those palm mutes goes a long way in terms of the overall mix. As you can see, it's very reactive, but it is clamping down whenever I palm mute. Typical settings that you want to go for when you're doing this kind of multi-band compression is very fast attack, very fast release. And then after that, you kind of just want to gauge around how much you want to take out and the threshold of when you want the multi-band compressor to kick in. For example, if I had it all the way up here, it gets really stringy because the threshold of when it's actually kicking in is super low, and it will kick in straight away. So you want it to be just at that point where it picks up the palm mutes and nothing else. And then straight after the multi-band compression, the last plugin in my rhythm guitar bus chain is Virtual Mix Rack. Now you don't need Virtual Mix Rack to do this. It's really simple. It's just a compressor with 3 different types of EQ that you can just do with normal plugins. However, I like doing it in this interface because it's just easier. So to start, we have a little bit of compression, and I'm not trying to absolutely slam the guitars because distorted guitars are compressed enough as they are. I'm trying to just glue it together ever so slightly so it doesn't sound too far apart in the mix. The gain reduction is anywhere between like 1 and 3 dB, so it's very subtle. You can see it when I play. So moving on to the next instance in Virtual Mix Track, which is a little bit of EQ. It's just a little bit of subtractive EQ like I was doing before, around that like low mid area where it gets really boomy and yucky. Taking out anywhere between 250 to 350, depending on your guitar tone and your playing style, goes a really long way into helping getting more definition out of your guitars in the mix. This is also a very common move in lots of styles of modern metal, especially when you're using such high gain guitars with distorted basses and stuff like that. So as you can see, it's a very thin Q at around 2.28, at around 260, 270 Hertz, with a lot of it being taken out at just over 4 dB. I'm just going to play the guitars with and without it so you guys can hear the drastic difference that it does in terms of getting more definition out of your guitars. So when it's not engaged, it gets a little bit more boomy, a little bit more bloomy, and it might not sound like the biggest difference in this instance, but when you do it in a whole mix, you can definitely hear it because it's not clashing as much with the bass guitars when you have it engaged. However, when it's disengaged, everything's trying to mold with it in that low region, and that's where low end gets really mucky. So taking that out goes a long way. So after you've taken out all that low end muck, the guitar can sound a little bit dry, especially when it's this high gain and it's all really high end focused and you've taken out a lot of low end. It can sound very dry and brittle. So the way I've tried to mediate that is by adding a little bit of boost at around 500 Hertz. Not as thin of a Q as over here, but it's still pretty thin at around 2 dB. I feel like this just gives my guitars a little bit more warmth in the mix and doesn't make it sound so scooped. So again, I'll play with and without. As you can probably tell, it gets very dry when you don't have that 500 boost engaged. And then from there, just a little bit of high-end boost just to make this guitar seem radio mix ready. Now the frequencies that I like to boost are anywhere between like 1.5k and 2.5k, where you get that like typical djenty, really bitey type of guitar sound. And then after that, I go for a really subtle high-end boost at anywhere between 5.5 and 6.5k. In this instance, I did it at 6.1 and it was just over a dB. Both of these very, very slight 1 dB boosts do go a long way in terms of getting your guitars heard in the mix and getting them cut through. I'll disengage it in a full mix and then I'll engage it so you guys can hear the guitars more clearly. So as you can probably tell, having that slight high-end boost in the guitars really does go a long way in terms of getting it heard in the mix. Without it, it kind of sounded like in the background, wasn't really like at the forefront of the song, which in this case I wanted it to be. So just adding that little bit of high-end boost does go a long way. And that's it. That's basically all the processing that I do on my main guitar tracks. Just a little bit of subtractive EQ, a little bit of multiband compression on the palm mutes, and just a tiny bit of compression and shaping, which are pretty standard moves anyway, but that's it. For me, it's mostly about just getting a good source tone because your job is pretty simple from there. It might seem a little bit underwhelming, but I can't stress enough how important it is to have a good bass tone that molds with your guitar, as well as having a good guitar recorded in the first place. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play the whole section and kind of A/B between having all of the guitar processing on and all of the guitar processing off. So as you can probably tell, when all of that guitar processing is off, it gets a little bit muddy. It kind of sits back in the mix. It's not at the forefront of the mix. It doesn't even feel like it's connected to the mix necessarily. But when it's all on, everything's glued together ever so slightly. There's a little bit of high-end boost kind of bringing life into the guitars, and it sounds like it fits the overall mix much better. So moving on from there, I'll just quickly go through all the layered guitar processing. I don't do much processing at all on my layered guitars. I did experiment with a little bit of multiband compression, but I ended up sucking so much low end as it was anyway that I didn't feel the need to engage it. So as you can see here on the layered guitar bus, there is a lot of low end cut being engaged at around 400. I'm really sucking the low end out of this guitar. And that's because the purpose of this layer guitar from the start wasn't to act as like a chord layer or anything like that. I wanted this to be pure like single note spanky split coil sound to really emphasize the chords that I was playing just through a single note on a split coil. So getting rid of all that low end wasn't really an issue for me because all I wanted from the start was that really like almost ice picky sound. However, there are certain frequencies that I did want to notch out, so I'll just quickly play them and then you guys can hear what I was taking out. So again, like I mentioned before, just taking away some of those whistly frequencies. However, the bulk of this EQ is being done by the low and high pass. So I'll just disengage those now so you guys can hear what it sounded like before I did that. It almost sounds like it's a bit of lo-fi happening when both of those are engaged, but it does fit the mix well, I think. So the only bits of processing I have on my clean guitars are EQ. Now, like I mentioned before, context is everything. You want to take things into consideration before you even start mixing. And the considerations for this instance was that the beginning of the track where it has that like roomy kind of vibe where it's really reverby, that's very lo-fi, and having like a really high def, really clean guitar in the midst of all that, it just wouldn't make sense and it would sound disconnected from the mix. So having this almost like a lo-fi effect on the EQ at the very start does go a long way in terms of gluing it all together, making it seem like it's meant to be there as opposed to just being on top of everything that's already happening. And then straight after that, we have a little bit of compression and high-end boost on virtual mix rack. I did read somewhere, or I think I saw a video of Pliny explaining that he does like to boost his clean guitars around that 15 to 16K area quite considerably. I tried it myself and I really liked it, and the compression is just kind of gluing the clean guitar together to make it sound like one nice track, as opposed to like really single picking and kind of getting lost in the mix. So I'll just demo it with all the clean processing and then without. As you can probably tell with the clean guitars, when you don't have virtual mix rack engaged and you just have the EQ, it does kind of get lost. It does kind of sound like it's buried a little bit. And then without the EQ, there are certain frequencies that kind of makes it sound a little bit whiny, a little bit whistly. But when you do add compression and do add that high-end boost, it does bring the guitars back to life a little bit. So yeah, that's pretty much all the processing that I did in this track. And for these main rhythm guitars like this EQ, this multi-band compression, and then this like general shaping and a little bit of compression here, as well as a little bit of high-end boost, these moves are very, very, very typical of what I would usually do in any demo that you've heard before on my YouTube channel or my Instagram. You guys will probably see this demo song reamped through another plugin at a later date or something like that. If you guys like this video at any time, please feel free to leave a like and a comment on anything you saw or heard. If you saw anything interesting or learned anything new, definitely leave a comment on that. If you guys want to see more of this stuff, more mixing tutorials and how I go about mixing, definitely leave a comment on what you want to see me do next. I have gotten a lot of questions to do stuff like this, so I'm happy to finally get something out. If you want to support the channel and what I'm doing, definitely check out the Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description. But as always, I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching. Ciao.